Welcome to our webinar this morning, where we will be talking to the HIV community about the people's vaccine. We are just waiting a few minutes to get all our panelists in order. While that is happening, my name is Lois Chingandu. I'm the Director of Evidence and Influence at Frontline AIDS. Just a bit of background and tips around of engagement. This is a virtual platform, as we all now know. We have translation in two main languages, French and Spanish. My colleague will put up a slide to show you what you need to do. Please turn off your phones. We would really appreciate that, or you put them on silent. You will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the discussions or the short presentations that we'll get from our panelists. We hope that today we will have more time for discussion. So I do urge my panelists to stick to the time that we agreed in your invitations. I have my red pen here. When you see it going like this, when it's going like this, it means you have about 2 minutes. When it goes like this, it means you really need to stop. Okay. So I hope I won't need to use it because I have a range of really experienced panelists this morning. So there's a slide there just to show you. There's an interpretation button which you need to press on your screen, and then you choose the language that you want. Thank you, Nazreen. Right, I think we are now ready to start. Let me just start by apologizing for one of our panelists. We were expecting the very, very eloquent Vuiseka. Unfortunately, she's not well this morning, and she has had to send her apologies. So we wish her a speedy recovery. Without further ado, just a quick background. Many of you are aware of the people's vaccine. I will not give details because that's what the panelists will do. But there has been a campaign for a people's vaccine that has been going on. We, together with UNAIDS, ITPC, and GNP Plus, agreed that I think we need to bring together the HIV community and have a conversation. So it's really a conversation that we want to have. And in that conversation, we are looking hopefully at answering two critical questions. The first question is, should the HIV community be involved in the people's vaccine? And if the answer is yes, why? And if the answer is no, why? And if, assuming the answer is yes, we need to be involved, how can we get involved? And this is what I'm hoping that my panelists will be able to speak eloquently to some of those questions. So I've invited the executive director of UNAIDS, Winnie Banyima, who has really been championing this people's vaccine from day one, to just talk to us, what made you get onto this bandwagon? UNAIDS is well known for HIV, and we got a bit surprised there when we saw you really moving and energetically with the people's vaccine. So we would really appreciate just to get from you, what was your thinking? What do you think is to be benefited by the HIV response when you get involved in the people's vaccine? Thank you, Winnie. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I really thank Christine Lois and the whole of Frontline AIDS team for your leadership in this work of fighting AIDS. And also now for convening this meeting for the community, the HIV/AIDS community, to understand whether they should have a role in fighting for access to health technologies for COVID, whether they should, and if so, how they should express a voice and fight. I'm also delighted to see that you have prepared a paper and published it, framing the issue, fighting for a COVID-19 people's vaccine, why the HIV community can make the difference. I encourage everyone to read it and share it more with our colleagues, activists in the HIV movement. It was the HIV movement that shifted the paradigm in tackling public health threats. Really, the area of public health was redefined by the HIV movement. How? By putting, first of all, by putting people and communities at the center of the fight. By framing the approaches to fighting the pandemic at the time with a human rights lens. Nothing for us without us was the voice of people living with HIV and key populations from the very earliest days, and it continues to shape the response. It was also the HIV community that challenged the current system of development, production, and distribution of health technologies, the whole area of access to medicines. That is regulated by WTO. It is, again, the HIV movement that put a challenge on it. When people in the rich countries had access to the benefits of science and were getting the new and the effective HIV treatments, ARVs, the large majority of people living with HIV in the developing countries were excluded, were left to die because treatments were unaffordable. I know this. I know many of you know this because you probably have family members, friends who would be alive today, but whom we lost because at that time, treatments were there, but not affordable for our countries. Why? Those lives, we estimate about 10 million people, because it took about 5-6 years before the prices came down. Why did they die? While others were living, their lives did not matter. Their lives didn't matter. And that's unacceptable. Today, many of the same countries with a high burden of HIV, high burden of other diseases, are faced with the same situation. They have HIV, they have COVID, they have other diseases, but today there is a race to find a COVID vaccine that could make a difference. But there is no certainty at all that people in the poorer countries will benefit from that vaccine immediately. They may still be waiting another 10 years as the price is hiked artificially for companies to make super profits before the lives of people in poorer countries can be saved. It was the removal of artificial barriers that prevented generic manufacturers from entering the ARV market. It was the removal of those barriers that brought the prices down. And that didn't come just by a quiet negotiation in the corridors of the WTO. It was people living with HIV putting up a fight. It was gay men in the northern countries with a spirit of solidarity who fought also with people in the south for these rules to be amended. The WTO Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health is a very important statement and it avails the opportunity for governments to use policy options to ensure access to medicines that are life-saving for their people. But these TRIPS, the WHO TRIPS agreement WTO TRIPS agreement that can be used to give countries their right to manufacture generics, to sell medicines, or rather to avail medicines to their people, this possibility is still entangled within other rules of the WTO, making it difficult for developing countries with some capacity to use those same TRIPS flexibilities to manufacture. I'll come back to that. So it is this movement that actually fought hard, and India was able to break through and manufacture ARVs. And today we have millions living long and healthy lives because of that. Today, the same country, India and South Africa, have applied before the TRIPS Council to be allowed to again move into the manufacturing of COVID medicines, and the same rich countries with their companies are blocking them. Why is this important? You could say, why COVID? We fight HIV, as you said. Well, because COVID, unlike HIV today, has not only taken lives, is not only impacting our health, but it has also crushed the global economy. The global economy has moved into a recession. Most of our countries are now moving into austerity. They are not able to finance, to raise the revenues to finance their health systems and deliver services. They are not able even provide social protection. The kids will not go back to school. So entire economies are shrinking because of COVID. Unless we find a solution to COVID, our entire development agenda is at risk, including the HIV response. Look at UNAIDS, the Secretariat of the Joint Program. We depend on just a handful of donors. All of them are now in the red because of COVID. They are not able, they won't be able to continue investing in the HIV response as they were in the past because they just have less money. So we are all affected by the COVID pandemic. For economies to begin to recover, for us to return to some kind of normalcy, we need to push hard for a vaccine, for health, even treatments that can turn this around. So you could say the reset button for the global economy, for our entire development agenda is controlling the COVID pandemic. It doesn't mean that we drop the HIV response, but we understand that the HIV response itself is in trouble unless we turn this vicious pandemic around. So we contribute in that fight. And how do we contribute? I think we contribute by bringing our legitimate voice, bringing the best lessons from the HIV response. It's not only about access to medicines, by the way. It is all these other strategies that have worked for HIV. Like I mentioned, putting human rights at the center, not trading off human rights with the response. It is about communities at the center and leading to deliver services for their people. It is about an all of society, all of government, integrated, multi-sectoral approach. These are things that came with the HIV response, still are within this response, and are what will help to win the battle against COVID as soon as possible. So it's about bringing everything we know and insisting that by fighting and bringing this HIV pandemic to this point, we have built the preparedness for future responses. We have built the experience that's needed for this one. Indeed, the countries that have used the learnings from HIV have done better in fighting the COVID response. So this one is another of our lessons. And by the way, the third point is this, that we have a global system, that is a global economy that is really rigged against ordinary people, that maximizes profits for a few at the expense of the lives and livelihoods of the majority, the 1% against the 99%. To change those rules, you need a crisis. In the area of public health, this is the opportunity. The pandemic is our opportunity to change the rules. So the people's vaccine, which I have mobilized with others, is about that. It isn't just about COVID. It is about the future and access to medicines and the right to health of all people and the right to access medicines. Because if we can manage to shift those rules, to insist that in a time of crisis and in normal times, human lives count before profits, investments by governments, public money that goes into innovation must count for people, must not be part of the profits of companies. It is by shifting those rules that we will ensure that even in the HIV response, we will be moving faster to a vaccine, to better treatments for infections that are associated with HIV, and even better and better treatments for prevention, rather medicines for prevention and for treatment, like PrEP for girls, PrEP that works for girls. We need more innovation there. We need more innovation in treatments for TB. We need more in the area of scientific innovation that gives us medicines at the right prices or at free at the point of use. But this can't change with us without tackling the trade rules on health technologies. That's what the people's vaccine is about. There are many things being proposed on COVID. One of them is this system of buying in bulk and reducing the price. That's fine. We are not against it. But that doesn't change the basic rules that are inequitable, that exclude most people from accessing the benefits of science. We are going for that, changing the rules. And crisis is the best moment to change the rules. So those are the reasons. One, that development agenda, include HIV response, is at risk with COVID crashing economies. We need to put in our hands to fight COVID so that we can reset the development agenda and protect our own response. Two, that the rules of trade do not put human lives after profits. Those rules must change. This is the opportunity to be part of changing them. The HIV movement has done it once before on ARVs and can come with the legitimacy, with the experience and the pain and the knowledge of organizing and fight to change the rules. Those are the main reasons why we should be a part, why we should lead, why when we speak, we will be listened to, because we carry both the pain and the successful story. Thank you so much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Winnie. So well said. I think it's in order if I clap my hands, and I think many people want to clap, because what you have done today is to put to rest a question that has been in our minds, all of us, and we just couldn't find the words to describe it. And you have described it so well. You know, the development agenda is at risk, including HIV. This is our opportunity. We need to reset the button. And so at this point, I think it's quite timely for me to invite the next speaker, Achal Prabala, to then talk to us. We started talking about the issue of for TRIPS flexibilities and the challenges. And you are one of the people who has been working in this area for a while, for a long time. Can you just share with us, what lessons can we take from HIV and intellectual properties and the issue of human rights? Please note, if you look in the chat, I'm not elaborating on the introduction of panelists because we are posting that in the chat, just in the interest of time. Thank you. Over to you, Achal.
Thank you, Lois. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I have the unenviable task of following Winnie Byanyima, one of the most charismatic individuals on earth. So I shall try to do my best. I'm so happy, though, to hear Winnie and to have her formidable intellect and charisma brought to this movement, because I think it's really injected a new life into it. And I certainly, for one, feel very, very grateful for it. So thank you, Winnie. I'm Achal Pravala. I coordinate the Access IPSA project. We work on access to medicines in India, Brazil, and South Africa. And I'm a fellow of the Shuttleworth Foundation. As Lois mentioned, I've been working on this for a long time. And appropriately, the first thing I'd like to do is to take you back in time to one afternoon in Cape Town. It was 1998. St. George's Cathedral in the center of the city was packed. And a young, relatively unknown activist called Zaki Ahmed took the mic. Zaki was there at a memorial service to celebrate the life of Simon Nkoli, an anti-apartheid activist, a longtime ANC member and a struggle veteran who's also gay and had just died of AIDS. So this is what Zaki said. 350 people a day die of AIDS in our country. I don't know about you, but that's a lot of people. He continued, a lot of people. The only reason we've been left to die is because we are poor, because we are Black, because we are women, because we are gay and lesbian. That is why we have been left to die. Zaki launched a movement called the Treatment Action Campaign, and they did many incredible things. But two of their achievements in particular, I think, stand out for the way that they endured and truly changed the world forever. It's not that everyone noticed, but they did. And the first great thing they did was to articulate the right to live in a way that we hadn't even thought of before. You know, today it's 2020, we say access to medicines, and now we all know what that means, especially in this room. And it seems so natural, so logical, but in 1998, no one really thought of it at all. Life-saving medicines weren't something that most human beings on earth thought was their right to have, especially if there were any one of those categories that Zaki mentioned: poor, Black, female, gay, or lesbian. So how much that's changed. But the second great thing they did was to create a template to gain access to medicines. They identified the targets, unjust pharmaceutical monopolies. They used the law, they used science, and the streets to break these monopolies down in their fight to live. That template, by the way, a template that was created by some of the most marginalized people on earth, right? Think of it. I mean, if you were gay, HIV positive, Black, poor, living in South Africa in the mid 1990s, you were on the margins of a marginalized society. So when we organize and fight for access to medicines today in the coronavirus pandemic, we should know that we are using exactly that template. We are part of that legacy. It stretches back 20 years, and it's a rich, powerful, and successful legacy that we should be really proud of. AIDS activists did not stop with AIDS. By the early 2000s, there were increasing concessions and means by which access to antiretroviral medicines was getting better and better. So what they did was they stepped up and they moved on to every other life-threatening disease that had been opened up by their work, from hepatitis C to cancers, from autoimmune diseases to cystic fibrosis. The power of the AIDS access to medicines movement was to tell everyone, no matter where they lived or what their income was, that they had a right to live. A few years before the coronavirus pandemic, this incredible template of activism actually went global, and I was witness to it, and I feel very privileged to have been. When I started working on access to medicines about 18 years ago, all the cases I worked on were poor countries. It was a problem of the third world. 2 years ago, in what I think is a remarkable testament to the power of this template, I worked with parents of children with cystic fibrosis in the UK, along with colleagues of mine at Just Treatment, fighting for exactly the same thing that we fought for in 2002, except with one difference. The people we were fighting for were white, middle class, and citizens of one of the richest countries on earth, the United Kingdom. The second thing I'd like to do is, for a moment, go even further back to a very crucial year, 1996. In many ways, the reason we're all here today, the reason that any of us do the work we do, and even the reason we have a problem facing us of access to vaccines in the pandemic is due to the events of 1996. So 1996 was the year that highly effective antiretroviral therapy was developed, thanks to the work of brave activists in the US who forced their government to take some action. What this meant was that AIDS in 1996 turned from being a death sentence, the kind of AIDS we remember from the 1980s and the early 1990s, to a treatable condition, a chronic condition like diabetes. 1996 was also the year that UNAIDS, the organization Winnie Byanyima heads, was created. A new organization devoted to stemming the onslaught of AIDS across the world, because by 1996, people had realized that the landscape of AIDS, if HIV and AIDS, had changed dramatically. The demographics had moved from it being a Western European disease to being a third world problem. It had literally moved from the first world to the third world. Now, if you just had those two facts alone, you would think that that's pretty good. So 1996, we discovered that suddenly there is an explosion of HIV and AIDS across the world, but hey, we also have a treatment. So this should be fine, right? Except it wasn't, because even though those two facts alone should have given us hope, there was one other thing that happened in 1996, and that is that the WTO was created, the World Trade Organization, which effectively, for the first time in human history, instituted a new global regime for pharmaceutical monopolies. So what was once a sovereign right now became a multilateral diktat. Now, these monopolies then proceeded to kill millions of people, as they waited 10 years in South Africa for access to antiretroviral medicines, as they waited for access to a miracle cure for hepatitis C in Brazil, in North Africa, in Eastern Europe, and finally, as they might kill millions and millions of people today as they wait for access to a coronavirus treatment or a vaccine. That's why we need the people's vaccine. The very last thing I'd like to say, departing from this history lesson, which I hope hasn't bored you too much, is to say that we are still in the same fight that began 20 years ago. But the terms of this fight are different, and we must recognize that. Today, I talked to you about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, creating this global monopoly regime that it enforces around the world. Now, what if I told you that in addition to this monopoly regime, there's another monopoly regime that governs vaccines? That there's another monopoly system that actually also governs the most promising treatments under investigation for coronavirus today. Monoclonal antibodies, or mAbs, you might have heard of them after Donald Trump was given an emergency infusion of a monoclonal antibody made by Regeneron. And what if I told you that this monopoly system was more insidious, harder to fight, and in fact entirely governed by the WHO, the World Health Organization? It sounds hard to believe, right? And I understand that, but it's true. The World Health Organization, the WHO, sets guidelines for countries on how they can approve a class of drugs we call biologics. These are complex molecules that require a different system of evaluation. Biologics, all mAbs are biologics, all vaccines are biologics. Now, the WHO could look at the evidence, it could reform its guidelines, but it has not. Instead, the system we have in place today makes it nearly impossible to create a generic biologic, or worse, a generic vaccine, right? The WHO could change that. Gavi, the organization that has made it its mission to bring another kind of biologic, the vaccine, to the whole world, could change that, but they have not. Worse, they have not shown any sign that they are even aware of this problem. So today, when the pharmaceutical industry says, oh, activists who ask for the dismantling of intellectual property don't know anything, that's not the barrier. They're half right. They're also half wrong, because intellectual property in the form of patents are very much still a barrier. But they're half right in the way that they are not the main barrier. There is another regulation barrier, which of course they've created. So it's a little thick for them to be telling us that you don't know this other problem that we created for you, which is basically what they're saying. This is what we're up against. It's a fight like no other, and in a way, an opportunity like no other. In the words of Winnie, it's grotesque, but it truly is an opportunity to fundamentally change the world. But while this is an old problem, it's also a new fight, and this is happening in a new time. And what we need to do is remember all the past strategies that worked for us, because they're still of use in this pandemic, but also develop some new ones. Thanks. Thank you, Lois.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I'm just like literally frozen. Just listening to you. I almost forgot I was moderating the session, and I was just shocked, particularly by the whole WHO involvement. And, you know, yeah, it's not in my place to comment, but what you have done is to take us through history. And fortunate for me, and I think many others, we lived through that history that you were sharing. And we all dreamt that one day we will win this to extend where we don't have to keep fighting. But listening to you, it looks like it never ends. Every time there's a new disease, we have to start all over again. And yes, I agree with you. This is a fight and an opportunity like no other. And we have to do it. And it just convinces us even more why we need to come together, whether it's COVID or it's HIV, because the bigger the numbers, the higher the chances of our success. Thank you very much, Achal. Let me also introduce our next panelist, who comes also from a very similar background, Solange Baptiste. Many of you know her from ITPC. ITPC has been around for many, many years, working on intellectual property. And so we asked Solange to talk about the two vaccines from the point that there's no lesser evil here. It's not an either or. So over to you, Solange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lois. So on this election, US election day, the people's vaccine is probably the only issue that I could actually focus on and not be totally distracted, because it's so near and dear to our hearts. Thank you for inviting ITPC to this panel, and thank you, Winnie, for the excellent framing. And obviously, I really want to applaud the bravery of UNAIDS under your leadership for going against the system and making this bold statement of the need for people's vaccine. And Achal, thank you for walking us through history and also making those compelling points, because sometimes we forget and we kind of then become friends with all these bodies, but sometimes we're not quite, it's not as transparent as it should be, where the things we need to fight lie. There's so much to say. At present, people living with HIV are standing at the front line of the COVID pandemic, right? The HIV community has always been fearless, and that courage has been on display in spades during this pandemic. I can give you examples all over the world. In Delhi, for example, people living with HIV got on their motorbikes, and over the course of 4 weeks, at great personal risk, contacted about 700 people, delivered ART to 200 people, referred others to the ART centers near and far. And there's so many stories of how people living with HIV sprung into community action during COVID-19. But it is also impossible to talk, about a people's vaccine and the role of the HIV community without talking about the pharmaceutical industry, right? And we know that the HIV community and big pharma go way back, as Achal reminded us, and Winnie, which means there isn't a single person in the HIV community that is surprised by the behavior of pharmaceutical companies working on therapeutics and vaccines for COVID-19. After 2 decades of community action on HIV treatment, we know that we have to challenge monopolies. When South Africans marched against big pharma's lawsuit to stop affordable generic ARVs reaching patients, they reminded us of the enduring lessons we all learn on the playground. Always, always, always stand up to a bully. People living with HIV and their networks have successfully advocated for compulsory licenses on crucial HIV treatments. And over the past 15 years, they have challenged patents and patent applications on HIV treatments and successfully shown that big pharma's house of profits are built on frivolous and flimsy patents. And that continues today. In Argentina, Fundación HEP has already challenged patents on remdesivir, and in Thailand, AIDS Access is clearing a path for generic favipiravir production through patent oppositions. We must also challenge the system. And I think Winnie spoke about this as well, because we can have a narrow focus, but it's the whole system that's the problem. The HIV community is all too familiar with the tactics being employed by Big Pharma because we have seen these same tactics for years now. High price deals for developed countries, crumbs for developing countries. Licenses that divide the world into haves and have-nots based on archaic, colonial, out-of-touch World Bank classifications. And what is truly disappointing is to see the strategies that seep now into the global health agencies. And I think this is what Achal was getting to as well. The approach to treatment and vaccine access for COVID hinges way too heavily on the voluntary actions of Big Pharma or on a capitalist market. And the industry is using every opportunity to maximize profits. It is time to call out also those enabling the system to perpetuate itself, those who are sidelining and minimizing the role of communities in global health decision-making. How are private foundations today more important than communities in determining who gets treatment, who gets vaccines, and how? The people's vaccine, right? The call for equitable access to any COVID-19 vaccine that is approved, because apparently we have to say that these days, is a crucial one. It is unreal that in the midst of the pandemic, we are forced to actually even have a campaign like this. It should be obvious. This really should be clear without having to say it, but yet here we are, having to say it, having to shout it, and having to have webinars to demand for it. There are three things I just want to make abundantly clear. First, we need to make clear the fact that every single vaccine being investigated out there is already a people's vaccine. It is not a favor. There is massive public investment and funding of the development of trials for these vaccines. Public, that is you and me. That is our money already invested in these vaccines. And yes, public investment in developing countries too. Not only are vaccine candidates being developed locally in many countries, the ones being developed by Big Pharma are also being trialed in developing countries, being tested on people in developing countries, being tested on the public. The public is you and me. So in fact, these are already our vaccines, and we need to debunk these myths around vaccine development and ownership. Secondly, we must also demand community participation, discussion and consultation in the development of these vaccines, in trial design, in access to timely information on trial results, and ensuring the ethical conduct of these trials. As communities, we have always been watchdogs in the scientific development and clinical trials of treatment and vaccines, and we must ensure that communities are central to the COVID-19 treatment and vaccine development as well. Thirdly, while every person must get a vaccine free of cost, we must also ensure that governments are not held to ransom by Big Pharma and IP barriers on vaccines, that our governments do not have to pay exorbitant prices. We must challenge high price points being put on the vaccines in development. And the alternative cannot be that we have to wait in line, or worse, fight the tiny percentages being donated or promised to the developing countries, or that people in developing countries get a free vaccine, but well after the developed world. We have manufacturing capacities. Are these being upgraded? Are these being geared up? We know what happens when we rely on one single source of medicine or vaccine: rationing, black marketing, profiteering. We need to prepare now to stop this from happening as vaccines get approved and start being rolled out. And lastly, if we zoom out, because I go through all these thoughts in my head, good ideas, point after point, and then you're like, but it still doesn't change. So if we zoom out, we see that despite valiant calls to reimagine systems for health, and I think this is something Winnie has also called for, there is no incentive for the established system to relinquish power. Public health is political. Good public health requires good leaders. And good leaders require an activated civil society to elect them and hold them accountable for safeguarding health as a right. Not a fluffy nice to have, but an enforceable constitutional right. So as we think about a people's vaccine and we think about the geopolitical antics of the powerful, the rich, and the high caste, the path to real change lives in the local, people-centered response. If there is no incentive for the established system to relinquish power, it will be taken by the people. And I just want to say, who are these people? I'll quote from one of our many leaders in the HIV movement who's risking his life to ensure access to treatment. He says, "We are afraid of corona. We want to stay home, but the deadly virus that we host is non-negotiable. That's why we work every day. We hardly sleep. I believe this pandemic illustrates the unique advantage of a PLHIV network, which other diseases like TB or even hepatitis do not have. How can we stay home if I know that my fellow community member is going to die without these medicines? And this is Loon Gante in India. We can see why the HIV community, its strength and its lessons that has learned over the past 2 decades will be central to addressing COVID-19. No one understands inequity in treatment access like the HIV community. No one understands the power of big pharma like the HIV community. And no one knows how to fight them like the HIV community. Thank you.
Yes, all these speakers, I feel like just clapping after each presentation. Solange, thank you so much. I think what you have done is to re-energize us and remind us why we do this work and why we need to continue to do it. And I think when you state categorically that this is our vaccine, we often forget that, and we find ourselves in a situation where we start pleading, we start begging, and yet you're right, the testing has been done on us. We are the people. We should determine who gets the vaccine and not the other way around. And to add with what Winnie said earlier, which is the HIV response is also at risk. And so we just need to fight. It's not an option. So at this point, I have the honor and privilege of asking my own boss to speak. The interesting thing about Christine is that she comes from all these, across the board, all these areas that we are discussing, starting when she was running Bonella in Botswana, then ITPC, then now she is at the front line. So, you know, your space.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lois. And really lovely company to be in. Thank you all. I feel it's really hard to speak as the last person because a lot of things have already been said, but let me put them in my own words. And let me also apologize for Vuiseka, who really wanted to be here this morning, but who is not feeling well. So she has been trying since last night to get herself to a place to join us, but she just wasn't able to. So her big apologies. I promised her that we would find another space because this is not a one-off conversation. So there will be a space where she will also contribute. So yeah, we, for Frontline AIDS, we joined this Alliance for a People vaccine right at the start, and mainly for 2 reasons. The first reason was that it was quite early on that it was evident that we were on a path that we had been on before. So a global health problem, which initially looked like a big leveler, and many of our politicians spoke of this leveling effect of COVID, affecting populations and countries everywhere in the world. But we realized very quickly that the reality was a different one. It became evident that this epidemic, like so many other health challenges that we have been working on, highlights the enormous health and socioeconomic inequities in countries and amongst countries or between countries. So those that have already struggled or were struggling with health and economic challenges were not responding from the same starting point to COVID-19 as those that were in a more privileged situation. So many organizations on the call here today, or even represented on the panel, today are on the front line of HIV and of COVID and know those inequities, and many of you have already spoken about them. So in a nutshell, health inequities that underpin so much of the HIV epidemic are equally at play in the response and in the experiences of COVID. And then secondly, initially the response was very much based on principles of solidarity and mutual support, at least to some degree. But it became very quickly clear that we were back in the old territory of whoever is privileged and has the greatest resources will have the best access to health innovation, including a possible vaccine for COVID. And that's exactly what many of us who have been around for a while experienced as in the access to HIV treatment movement in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And Achal has given a beautiful history lesson of that. the way that I remember that history and that experience is that what you get into is a complex web of very technical discussions that reemerges, where many of the old issues attached to it, the lack of transparency about deals that were being made, but fundamentally about the same issues that many of you have already spoken about. Those issues are around whether a health emergency requires a pause, a questioning of the status quo of how governments, research institutions, and the pharmaceutical industry determine who will have access to life-saving interventions. We know that access to medicines and diagnostics does not happen because of the industry or even the international community making it a priority for poor people, poor communities, or indeed poor countries. This happened because we fought for access, and we have already spoken about that. It happened because communities demanded it. We went to court for it, or as Ruiseka, Solange, or myself would say, we toy-toyed for it. We went to the streets and we cried and we screamed and we said, it needs to be possible that we get access to that medicine. Many of us spent a good part of our earlier professional lives to ensure that communities were knowledgeable, were organized, were fearless, in how they were articulating those demands. And the one thing that we learned right from the beginning, and ITPC is a good example of that, is communities need to have the technical knowledge to make the demands so that they can respond to those rebuttals about you don't understand, it's too complex, it has to do with very complex technical issues. And we did that even though people were telling us that the trade rules wouldn't allow us to do it, that communities didn't understand the full context, and that governments in the global south could not demand that. We all know that these arguments, that we won those arguments, and that much of the great treatment access, as Vinny has said, even though it's not perfect, and we shouldn't forget that, there's still pockets of bad treatment access, even in the HIV world. But the access that we have is because communities fought for it. And it's exactly that history, that knowledge, and that wisdom that we can bring to the table now to cut through very complex technical debates, to get back to the fundamental issue of the fact that a vaccine must be available and accessible to those who need it most. Those frontline health workers, especially in fragile and under-resourced health systems, those marginalized communities who will again be the last in the queue. Many people living with HIV will be in that queue across the world who might also have other complex health issues to contend with. People who use drugs, sex workers, the LGBT community. And any vaccine that will be available must be affordable to governments, and importantly, must be free of charge at the point of the end user. In my mind, it was clear right from the start what we need to contribute and lead the call for a people vaccine as the HIV movement. But, and there is a big but, we do need to ask ourselves whether such engagement diverts us from other critical work. In the early days of this pandemic, Frontline AIDS, ARASA, and several TB and TB partners released a global call to action on HIV, TB, and COVID-19. And our very first ask was governments, donors, and UN agencies to sustain the HIV and TB response through the COVID pandemic. More than 200 organizations signed that call since then, and many of you are on this seminar. And I'm sure that the ask to sustain HIV and TB services remains our primary concern. And we have already, Winnie has already articulated that. We can't divert or divorce one from the other. We know that even before COVID came we faced COVID, we faced an HIV prevention crisis. We are failing to get below 1.7 million new infections a year. Last year, again, before we had any COVID pandemic, almost 700,000 people died of AIDS. And we have all seen the dire warnings by UNAIDS and by others that next year, because of the disruption of COVID, we will have even more people infected and more people possibly dying. But without effective treatments or a vaccine, we can also expect to see many more people who have survived HIV and have survived TB dying of COVID-19, alongside huge numbers of frontline health workers, whether in the public or in the community health sector. And we, those frontline workers that we need in both health sectors to provide HIV services. Indeed, we saw this risk from the outset too, and that is why our call to action also demands that governments, donors, and the international community protect human rights through this new pandemic, including by ensuring that new vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 are available and affordable for all in line with the right to health. So in my view, we must be involved in the campaign for a people's vaccine, but we must be smart as to how we make the argument, to connect the issues of accessibility and availability to a future vaccine to the fact that such demands are made within a bigger context of an HIV epidemic that continues to grow and will do now so even more because of COVID-19. We have so much to offer, and many of the speakers have spoken about that, as the HIV movement to catalyze this campaign for a people vaccine, and most importantly, our historical knowledge, but also importantly, and both Solange, all of you have spoken about that, we can contribute those community systems that we have built up over the decades within the public health sector, but also within civil society. And it's for that reason that Frontline AIDS came together with UNAIDS, with ITPC, with GMP Plus, to have a first step of putting together a paper to really articulate how we can make a difference as the HIV movement. We shared it before this webinar. I hope many of you had a moment to look through it. And there we really describe our history and our experiences in demanding access to medicines and giving some voice to people living with HIV, to HIV activists who speak to both living with HIV and their experience of being infected with COVID-19. And we also talk about what the campaign is about, so you can see how you could get involved if you want to be involved, and how we can support it as the movement. So I hope you will have a moment to look at it, and we are always happy to change it and to bring different arguments to the fore. I think part of the arguments today are already interesting to see how we can enrich that paper in our thinking. So I'll end here, but what I really wanted to end with is us having an open discussion with participants, and that's why we organized ourselves like that. So we can ask ourselves these critical questions. We can ask Winnie, do you think we are diverting attention from HIV when we're talking about a COVID vaccine? Can ask Frontline AIDS, should you not be talking louder about HIV prevention and HIV treatment instead of COVID-19, because everybody's talking about COVID-19. So let's ask ourselves those questions, those hard questions. Let's talk about our own resources, human, financial, intellectually, and how we best bring them all together to make the best out of a very difficult situation at the moment. I enjoy my company. I hope we can have an open discussion, and I hand back over to you, Lois. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. I like it when you say we are back in the old territory. But the advantage we have is this is a territory that we know. We have walked it before. We have toyed it before. We have sat in front of doors. We have knocked doors, and we are brave. So we come fully equipped as the community of HIV to do something like this. Thank you very much. I will ask Winnie if you want to react quickly before I open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Lois, and thank you, panelists. Really, you have made my day. This is like my best webinar in many months, because you are experts in this field. I'm talking about Ashal and Solange, and you have marshaled the reasons why the HIV community should lead, should participate in fighting this injustice of inequity in access to medicines. I just wanted to share the 4 things, I'm not sure who is on the line, the 4 things that the people's vaccine is fighting on, so that it's clear to those who have not engaged, if they engage, what it is we are trying to achieve. One is, yes, breaking the monopolies on vaccine and treatment production. And as the panelists have said, this is about changing the system. It's not a one-time thing, but it's about changing the system so that we are sure as we go into the future that we can have Equity in access to medicines, that's part of the right to life. There is a pool that was set up called the CTAP, COVID Technology Access Pool. It is supported by a number of countries, mainly from the South, led by Costa Rica. It doesn't have the support of the rich countries who host those big companies that are already making whooping profits on this, on speculation about the vaccine. No, but it is supported by developing countries and some rich countries like, I think, Norway, some of the rich countries. So the CTAP is there, and that's what we are supporting, because if companies can put their technology there and it is shared, then we can have production across the world. Two, we are fighting on ensuring an affordable prices, making pricing transparent, taking off the cost of the public money that has already been put there, so that they get a reasonable profit for their innovation, but the price comes down. Third, fair allocation of the vaccine. This is critical. The WHO has come up with a framework that we are supporting, and this framework puts 4 categories first in every country, starting with health workers, so that all our health workers are safe as they fight for our lives. 2, elderly, people who are older because of their higher vulnerability. 3, those with other infections like diabetes, hypertension, all those infections that make people more vulnerable to COVID. That's the 4th category. 3rd category. And the 4th one, I'm trying to remember, but my colleagues on the panel will remember. But the argument is that these 4 categories make up about 20% of every population. So if the vaccines that are manufactured today can be allocated to 20% of every country to cover that most vulnerable part, then others can come in later. But first, ensure every country has that. It's so stupid that the vaccine can be available for everybody in a rich country while health workers die in another. So that's fair allocation of the vaccine is another priority, another aim. And then we want free of charge at the point of use for all people. This should be a negotiation between governments, and it's a pricing negotiation between governments and companies, but to ensure that ultimately the vaccine is available free of charge and you don't have to die because you can't afford. Lastly, and that's part of pricing, participation, and Solange spoke to the issue. Full participation of developing country governments and civil society around the world to be part of the decisions around development, manufacturing, and distribution of the vaccine. Those are the issues. And let me say, we are making progress. We're making progress, but I don't want to eat in the time of participants. But later on, if there's a chance, I'll tell you how we have shifted some positions of the hardest companies like Moderna, but that I can leave for later. Thank you, Lois.
Thank you very much, Winnie. Thank you very much to all our panelists. I will now open the floor for questions. The format we have agreed is that you can raise your hand and you will be unmuted so that you ask your question directly. This is a conversation. Where that is not possible, put your question in the Q&A chat and we will find a way. We will then ask it to the panelists. So let's see if there are people who are ready to ask. Please, ground rule, you cannot ask a question that takes more than a minute. It becomes a presentation. So if you do that, I will be forced to mute you, the power of the moderator. So let's try to keep our questions very short let's say, indicate who the question is targeted at, and then you ask your question. Okay. While that is, while I'm waiting to see if people are willing to ask their questions directly, I see a question from Enrique. Can you ask your question directly, Enrique?
All right, thank you very much, panelists. You put me on the spot, Lois. That's why you typed down, to hope that you just leave the question and you're not really being asked again. I wrote down about the Lancet, which I think recently, I mean probably last week, cautioned that the kinds of vaccines that are being developed for COVID-19 could potentially put at higher risk of HIV acquisition for people at higher risk of HIV and in populations that are at higher risk of HIV. And I would like to hear from you guys in terms of the narrative of the people's vaccine. What do you make of this assessment? Because obviously it has a lot of various ramifications to it. Thank you very much. It's been a great presentations, and that also made my day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique. There's another question from Adolf. Can you ask your question directly, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Lois. Good to see you. And fantastic presentations from the panelists. So I have been following this discussion, and one of the things that I noted yesterday was a tweet from the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros. And this is a tweet which has since gone viral, where he said, I quote, "The need for a COVID-19 vaccine is very real, but it will not fix the vaccine vulnerabilities affecting us all. There is no vaccine for poverty, hunger, inequality, climate change, or misguided nationalism. Global commitment to end these scourges is urgently needed." And just out of interest from Dr. Tedros' tweet, I just wanted to get the panelists' quick responses or comments to that tweet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adolf, for that question. I don't see any other question for now, so I'll allow the panelists to respond. Any one of you who feels this is a question they would like to address. There are two questions, one on the Lancet, the other one is on the Director General of WHO's tweet. Yes, Achal?
Sure, only because there was no other hand up, but please go ahead otherwise. On the WHO Director General's tweet, I think that there's nothing to disagree with anything that he says there in terms of global income inequality and poverty. I don't think that anyone would hold the WHO solely responsible for fixing income inequality or poverty. I do, however, think that we would hold them responsible for creating a people's vaccine, and there is more that they can do in that regard.
Let me come in too to add to Ashal. I agree with Ashal. I think that, I mean, I'm just guessing. I think that Tedros was talking about the fact that the vaccine is important, but doesn't solve all the problems that doesn't solve the entire problem of COVID and pandemics and preparedness and all that. I think that's what he was saying, and I agree with him. I think his point may have been, let me put it this way, there are some people who think that pursuing aggressively a people's vaccine means that we think that the vaccine is a magic bullet. We don't think so. Actually, we are pushing for a people's vaccine, but the agenda is broader. It's about breaking a system that is unjust and that puts people's lives, puts profits before people's lives and excludes most people in the world from having access to medicines. So we're trying to break that system by focusing on this vaccine that has benefited. But first of all, the system has collapsed. The system of intellectual property protection has collapsed because it's based on profits of companies driving innovation, the profit motive. But now innovation is being driven by public money. You see, the crisis has forced governments to come in and invest heavily, breaking this system that has always cheated most people. So now we're saying, since the system has broken, let's build a new one based on fairness, based on the right to health of all people. All lives matter. So we are not fighting for a vaccine just as one vaccine for COVID. But I think sometimes people get a narrow view of what our objectives are here. I don't think Tedros got it wrong, but I think that there are people who might misinterpret his message in that sense. Yes, we are fighting poverty, inequality. We are fighting an unjust global economy. But this is part of it. This is the part that we want to fix, which is about the rules concerning development, manufacture, and distribution of health technologies. I hope I have made it clear.
Can I follow on?
Yes, Solange, then Christine.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, thank you for those thought-provoking points. I wonder if we all agree that the system is not working. I think for some rich, powerful nations, it works pretty well. And what you need to do is protect more what you have so that those others don't get what you have. And I think that's where we come into this divide where we're now sort of, how could you misinterpret this tweet? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it's because your brain is somewhere else. You actually see the world quite differently. So yeah, I with respect to that point, I think it's an interesting thing to debate. The system is working quite well for some parts of the world. Sorry, and then for the point with the Lancet, I just wanted to say that I don't know about the specifics on the clinical aspect of it, but I just thought that the Lancet article, Enrique, kind of reiterates that point that for community participation in clinical trial design, not just give me the injection and sign me up with informed consent, but really from the design, who is, because it's not a some people's vaccine, it's a people. It's for everybody, people's vaccine. So therefore you have to have diversity in the design and you need to have access to timely information. If you start seeing warnings or outcomes that are interesting, that need to be tweaked, that needs to be public, that needs to be transparent. And then, you know, ensuring the ethical conduct during the trials as well, right? And we have many examples of where certain things happen to certain people of color and you just kind of don't let them know. So we're in a different strange world now where we have to hold these people to account. So I'm not so concerned about the fact that there is some potential for something, but if we have enough community participation, we can walk through this process together, right? Because we're not saying that pharmaceutical industry or medicine or trials is the enemy. We're just saying, let us be involved and do it together.
Can I just add to just
Yes.
like the point that Solange is making? I think it's really also, it just highlights, I am not familiar with the particular details of the Lancet argument, but it makes, and it just highlights another issue again, right? So the vaccines that are being developed from the vantage point of communities where you don't have high HIV prevalence, right? So that might have never been something you've taken into consideration when you were starting to think about that. And here is again our argument, what we can bring to the table as the HIV movement to make sure that whatever vaccine, and there are many, we know there are many candidates at the moment, that whatever is being developed will also work for countries with high HIV prevalence, right? So it again speaks to that inequity. Where do industries and research organizations, what is the starting point? They're trying to serve a market that will be profitable, and it is not necessarily in mind with countries. So for example, in Eastern and Southern Africa, where we have high HIV prevalence in general population. So I think it just makes our argument not only for community involvement, but also to start thinking from the beginning, who will have access to whatever will be successful in the end. I also wanted to make another point, which is something we spoke about a lot about when we wrote the paper, which was the point from an HIV movement perspective. You know, we have had a year, just about a year of the COVID pandemic. And immediately we have how many vaccine candidates? Like 35 or something. But we have had 35 years of vaccine trials or development for HIV. And we don't have, you know, great successes there. And that might not be a technology problem, right? It might not be because we can't find a solution. Yes, it is challenging to find a good vaccine for HIV, but it also hasn't had the resources and the effort by the world community and by the research community, partly because it might not be as profitable when you find that vaccine. And I think that's another thing that what we might want to think about in our work at the moment is to see how can we maybe shift some of that attention to a possible HIV vaccine, some of the learning to an HIV vaccine, but also some of the moral arguments around why it is important that we find an HIV vaccine as much as it is important that we find a COVID-19 vaccine. And just to echo everybody else's comments based on Adolf quoting Tedros, you know, I think all that Tedros, as far as I'm concerned, all he was talking about is these health inequities and global inequities. You know, they're not going to be fixed by a vaccine. No, they're not. But the vaccine falls right in the middle of that. And that's what we're talking about this morning.
Achao?
Thank you, Lois. I'm just going to step in for one quick second. Christine, I just wanted to say that I guess I'll offer without comment that the person who led the unsuccessful effort for an AIDS vaccine for several of those decades that it exists has, is now in charge of delivering half the world from the coronavirus pandemic as the head of Gavi, and it's something I offer without comment. I just wanted to say, Winnie brought up PrEP. PrEP is, as all of you here especially will be familiar with, is sold as Truvada in the United States. In response to Enrique's question, obviously I'm not a doctor and I don't know the science, and I think that if there is an interaction between susceptibility to HIV and a new coronavirus vaccine, that's concerning. But there is a pill that you can take that many sexually active men and women do take in order to nearly completely prevent the risk of HIV infection. It's called PrEP. In the United States, it costs $20,000. Do you know what it costs in India? It costs $300 a year to take, right? $20,000. So what's happening in the US is that the US government is suing Gilead, who are the patent owners of, the monopoly owners of PrEP, 2 months literally before they signed a huge agreement to buy up all their doses of remdesivir, which might or might not work in the pandemic. It's really funny. Solange was mentioning that this system does work for some people. For me, as an activist working on this for 18 years, the greatest realization has been that we have to think about who those people are. Because when I started out working in 2005, we always imagined that in the US and the UK, everyone was partying and having fun and enjoying great lives at the expense of these trade deals that were causing countries in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia to collapse. But the truth is that the problem has been exported even to those countries. If you're middle class and you live in the United States, you cannot afford PrEP. It's $20,000 a year without any universal healthcare. How can you afford to buy that, right? It affects the United Kingdom. There are children who died in the hundreds over 4 years when the richest health system in the world, the National Health Service, could not prescribe a drug for cystic fibrosis because it couldn't afford it. So this problem that started in the third world is a problem of the whole world. There are a very small set of people benefiting from this pandemic and every pandemic in the past. Pharmaceutical corporations. It is not even the people who live in rich countries who are profiting off it. It is merely a handful of companies in those countries who are. Thanks.
Thank you. I will go to the next round of questions. There's a question from Patience Dube and Desmonio Omboto. If any one of you is ready, please ask your question.
Thank you, Mama Lois. Thank you very much to the panelists for the informative presentation. So as a young person coming from a community-based organization, I'm just interested in knowing or understanding our role as community-based organizations in advocating for the people's vaccine, especially in developing countries. How best can we engage governments to prioritize access to COVID-19 medicines through the national budget process? Because I think this speaks to the issue of preparedness and readiness of different countries around emerging health issues and even around natural disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Patience. Next question. Desmonio. He's not here for now. Can the panelists oh, he's here. Okay. All right, you're on, Desmonio.
Yes, hello, am I audible?
Yes, very audible.
So my name is Desmonio Mbota, a public health nutritionist from Kenya, and I've been following closely a lot of these discussions and conversations from Health Gap, UNAIDS, and such webinars. They really trigger a lot of creativity and how we can achieve the people's vaccine in the shortest time possible. So my question was, it's just a thought. Don't you think these conversations are slowing down? You see, the companies producing these, the companies or institutions producing these vaccines, don't you think our conversations are making them to at least maybe slow down or rethink? I don't know. I don't know if I've been gotten clearly.
Yes, I think are you saying these discussions and these fights will probably discourage those who want to produce the vaccine?
Yes.
If they think they are not going to make a profit.
Yeah, that's it. That's the question. Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Panelists? Any volunteer to the two questions? How can the community-based organizations engage with governments? What role can they play? I think earlier on we talked about the deals that governments are making. Maybe one of you wants to comment about that. Chrissy?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that community organizations can do is, and that's why I was talking about treatment literacy. It's really important that organizations really understand what it is we are asking for and why we're asking for it. And that's why we put the paper together. And Winnie also talked about, we have a vaccine, there's a website for the people vaccine with lots of info. Matteo has kindly put it in the chat so that people can have access to it. There is videos on there and so forth. So I think it's really important that we help community organizations to really understand what we're asking, to articulate the demand for their own countries and actually have that conversation with their own governments about, are you aware? Are you participating? Are you engaged in this wider debate? And like we all spoke about, these conversations, even with treatment access, didn't happen because people just woke up and wanted to have those conversations. Communities demanded their governments to have those conversations. So we need to, I think they can play a really vital role. There's a few actions in our paper where we say to people here, this is what you could do. There is a letter, a survivor letter that we have put together that has been going around. There's several actions, but I think fundamentally it's to really help people fully understand what the demands are, what the issues are, and helping them to articulate how they can engage with government. And as Winnie has said, I think that's one of the big advantages that we have as the HIV movement. We have figured out how to work as critical friends to our governments, demanding things, but also in partnership with our governments to articulate demands and help governments to articulate them at the global level. So I think that's a first step of what communities can do.
Let me add something here. While COVID has hit the whole world, when you look at our developing countries, you will see that the health impact is perhaps not as severe as it has been in the richer countries. But when you look at the economic impact, the social impact in our countries, it is huge. Our poor countries have had to take quite extreme measures to protect themselves, first of all, from a virus that was coming from outside their borders. They moved to close down entire economies to try to protect. But now we know the virus has moved in and is being transmitted through communities. That is making them take even more measures to protect the spread, to stop the spread. The cost of these economies is huge, really huge. Yet we know that the vaccine that is now being developed, the vaccines being developed, have been booked out. The rich countries, representing about 13% of the global population, have booked out more than 50% of the doses so far. So you're looking again at a situation where we are all affected, we are losing more, but treatment, vaccine will come and help others to move on while we will remain struggling. You also see that their own economies are being stimulated. They are rich. Those countries are rich. They are pumping in money, trillions, to revive their economies and their industry. We have nothing to fall back on. So the issue of getting the whole world to control the pandemic, every country to have the capacity to control the pandemic, is important. It's important because we will be left behind, struggling while others move on. That's one. The other point is that our efforts are winning. We are seeing, but we need more pressure. But we are winning. There was this company called Moderna. Let me share about it. It's an American company based in Boston. It got more than close to $3 billion of public money to invest in finding a vaccine. I think they're using the technologies that Ashal is talking about. I'm not an expert here. But when they were tackled about earlier on about whether they are going to, for them, they booked out all of it to rich countries at high prices up to $30-something a dose. They had not even reserved any crumbs for the poorer countries. So when they were challenged, they said, no, we are in this business for profit the first time. So we are in this business for profit. All our doses have been booked by those who can pay. When our pressure mounted, when our coalition grew, they've shifted now. They're now saying that they will not enforce COVID-19 vaccine patents during the pandemic. Now, you can interrogate that and say exactly what do they mean, but they are recognizing that the pressure has built up, that they can't go on insisting on profit. They must allow for more companies to manufacture and bring the prices down. On top of that, so we are seeing cracks in the wall. We are seeing cracks in pharma. We are seeing governments talking a different voice. The French government has been talking a language closer to ours, even though they are also invested in some of the manufacturing, the development. what we are seeing, what we have to push hard for is that we can't depend on the goodwill of a company to say, I won't enforce my patent. No, we want them all to be required to put their patents in a pool so the knowledge is shared, the vaccines are arrived at more quickly, production is done by more companies, and we are all served. But we are getting there. The cracks are happening, and we just need to build the pressure. That is what I know how to do. And I'm not going to stop. I had some skepticism from some HIV groups in the beginning, but I thank you for taking the step to convene and explain and show why it is important for all of us to be in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Winnie. The more we understand, the more, we feel we really need to be part of this. I think the way you keep explaining it, the way you keep linking it to our economies, and we know when our economies are crumbled, that means even our governments will not be able to respond to HIV. So the linkages are there, and they are very, very, very strong. And I also think you have explained Desmonia's concern. From experience, I think the panelists can confirm, we have never known of a pharmaceutical company which stopped producing because of the pressure. If many of you remember, at every international conference, activists will break their display cabinets, and by the following morning, there will be a new one there. So they make so much money that they will not be affected by, our noise. Some will change, and we will win, as Winnie has indicated. I don't see any more questions in the space. I will just go around the panelists, one word from each of the panelists as your closing remarks. Where do we go? And I would appreciate if some of you can just respond to the issue of how do we balance? How do we make sure we don't lose the HIV voice and the HIV fight in all this? Solange, your hand up. Your final concluding.
My hand was up to say something else. Now you've asked.
Yes, you are welcome.
It's
your concluding remarks, and if you can touch on what I've just asked, any one of you can do that.
What I wanted to say was, I don't think that COVID-19 is the end. Like, we fix this and we get back to normal.
Yeah.
I think if we heard Jane Goodall at the one of the IAS sessions, she was talking about the fact that you don't blame the bats. Don't blame the bats. It's the humans and the trajectory we're on for how we're interacting with the climate and how humans are interacting with nature. This COVID-19, there'll be 20, 21, 22. There will be something in the future. And so it is upon us, I think, to really take up the call to action from this whole session, and what Winnie has also said, that COVID-19 is an opportunity. The opportunity is in the crisis. And we see it as an entry point to be able to fix a system which doesn't work for almost 99.9% of the people. Because I hear Atul's point, like even in the countries that are rich, it's not just this country is dominating of another. It's a few people in a country that are dominating because they're owned by pharma and they have the power. So we need to call it out. I mean, I think that's where I think the balance is. Not at the expense of another disease, keep the holistic whole systems view and really call it out. We need to have a call for transparency and in decision making. Thanks.
Thank you. Achal, your last
Thank you.
words?
Thank you. Thank you very much. When the pandemic first hit, obviously I wasn't planning on working on it, but I felt compelled to because of my background as an AIDS activist. And I still feel very much committed to that same mission, and I see it as one continuum. This is the same struggle. I started working on this in 2002, and I'm working on the same thing now. That, I think, is very much the legacy that many of us here come from, and we must continue it. But there's also a frustration. When it first started, the pandemic, I truly believed that what I needed to do and fight for was to make sure that exceptions that were going to be made for treatment and vaccines and access to them in the pandemic did not remain exceptions, but were applied to the system so that it could affect people with antiretroviral access or hepatitis C medicine access. Very quickly, 4 or 5 months into the pandemic, it became increasingly clear that not only is the systemic change getting further and further away, but actually that we would actually have to fight for exceptions even in this pandemic, right? So I think what's been disappointing is how my expectations of the world were in some way overturned. What has been promising, however, I think, is the fact that there are coalitions like this, that there are old and new people joining in. I think what's still promising is the fact that my own parents, I love them very much, they love me, we live 5 minutes away from each other. But for 18 years, I don't think they understand what I did. And they've never understood it. And it's only in the coronavirus pandemic, after all of us, got it and were suddenly really concerned about access to vaccines. But now my parents actually understand what I do. And I feel that there is a glimmer of hope that this thing that I've worked on, which pretty much no one I know understands, is now of universal concern, and that will still be of some value to us. And so that's where my hope lies.
Thank you. Christine?
Yeah, I think for me, two things. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's really important that we use this moment, and it feels really like this moment where a lot of things are going, there's an opportunity for real change, because this has brought together a lot of issues that people knew that they affected all of us equally: the environment, poverty, economic injustices, and so forth. But we haven't brought them together. We have worked alongside each other, but we haven't created broader movements around social justice that speak to HIV, that speak to border health issues, that speak to environment or environmental injustice and the environmental crisis, but also the economic crisis. And I think this is the beginning, like Solange says. Next year we will feel the impact of this crisis has had on donor countries. We'll feel the impact in the countries in the global south, even more so. So this is the moment where we need to get together in broad-ranging coalitions and consortia, I think, to work on this. And I think if there is opportunity in disaster, this is the opportunity. And this disaster won't end here. I agree with Solange. The only thing, and I think for me, it's really important that we do keep on talking about the connection to HIV as HIV activists. And that's the value add that we can bring. And we have all done that really eloquently here this morning, but we need to keep on doing it so that people understand why it is that we are involved. And it's not because we have the historical knowledge of how to do it, but because there's real impact right now on the HIV epidemics. And this is why we need to be involved. It shouldn't be a competition of pandemics, which is awful, but I think it does happen very quickly. We all know that from the past. It's a bringing together, but a focus and a highlight from our perspective as the HIV movement that we can bring to it.
Your final words, Winnie? You are on mute.
I can say it again.
Okay, just to thank you, Lois, for moderating, and for my fellow panelists for bringing your knowledge, your expertise, and your power into this fight. We are not near winning, but we are making cracks in that wall, and let's just keep fighting. We can't give up hope and let a few people drive the world because of their greed. This is an issue of social justice, and I'm happy to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panelists and all the participants for attending. In conclusion, and in terms of forward looking, I heard three very important things. I did hear one of the panelists talking about a call to action for the HIV community. I think this is something that we need to think going forward, a call to action that articulates what Chrissy, you were saying, which is what is the impact that we can achieve and what is it that we can do. Patience did a very good job by asking us at a community level, what can I do? We need to articulate that and make it very clear that there is a role for everyone in this campaign. And lastly, I think one of you also mentioned the critical role that can be played by the coalitions, that we need to continue to strengthen the coalitions so that the voices can become louder and louder and louder. And we need to make sure that every region is engaged and involved in this conversation. So with that, I would like to thank you very, very much for taking the time to come and spend this more than 1.5 hours talking about this important topic. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. We have a lot of work to do, and we leave this space today energized, and that's what we needed and wanted to get out of this place. Thank you so much to my Frontline AIDS team behind the scenes who made this happen, Mateo, Nazreen. Thank you so much for making this a reality. And to my peers who are in the group, thank you very much. And the partners from all over who came to participate, we really appreciate your contributions. And to Winnie, again, thank you very much for the vision and the foresight and being able to stand with it up to this point. We just want you to know that you are fully supported. We are right there behind you on this agenda, and we look forward to the future. Thank you to all of us, and goodbye.
Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.